Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are going to start our study of a new book, that is the book of Ezra. We are continuing on the series of books of the Torah that deal with the time period of the early Bayis Sheni, the early Second Temple period. So we studied together Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those are the last three of the prophets. Chagai and Zechariah were two prophets who accompanied the exiles as they came back from the Babylonian/Persian exile to rebuild the Second Temple and to rebuild the community, the Jewish community in Judea, in Israel, centered around Jerusalem. And Malachi was also was the last prophet, and he was a little bit later than Chagai and Zechariah, maybe a generation or two later, during the early Bayis Sheni, the early Second Temple period. Ezra, we're going to learn about soon, was a very important and often overlooked figure in the history of the Jewish people. Ezra was the religious leader of the Jewish people during the same time period as Malachi. That's a little bit after the Bayis Sheni, after the Second Temple had already been built. But it was only standing for a short period of time, maybe a generation or two, unclear exactly how long. And Ezra is generally looked upon as the one who designed the transition, the transition between a prophecy-based religion and a Torah study-based religion. Therefore, Ezra could be considered the founder of the rabbinate, the first rabbi, so to speak, in the modern sense of the word, meaning a religious leader, one who teaches religion, teaches Torah to the people and how to keep the Torah to the people, but not necessarily through the methods of prophecy. Now, according to Chazal, many identify Ezra with Malachi, that he actually was also a prophet. So he therefore would signify both the end of the prophetic period and the beginning of the rabbinic period. So his importance in the development and the future of the Jewish religion and the Jewish people cannot possibly be overstated. The first several chapters of the book we're about to read don't even deal with Ezra himself. They're basically a recap of the history of the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, to Judea, to Jerusalem, to building the temple in the early Bayis Sheni, the early Second Temple period. One of the things that we're going to see in today's chapter, the first chapter, is a lot of both contrasts and parallels to the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Of course, in the Exodus from Egypt is a story most of us are very familiar with. It is one of the Jews were slaves in Egypt and suffering under the harsh rulership of the Pharaoh, of Paro, and then God, who had made a promise to the forefathers, to Abraham, to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saw the Jews in their pain and came to rescue them from Egypt and sent his prophet Moses to rescue them. And we were familiar with the story of all of the ososum of sim, all of the great signs, wonders, and miracles, and then culminating, of course, in the splitting of the sea, eventually receiving the Torah, and then coming to the land of Israel, and so on. Now, the story being told of the return to the Second Temple is markedly less dramatic. Much, much, much less drama. However, even though there was much less drama, there are some things which we can compare, and there are some things which we can contrast. In terms of comparison, the surface comparison is the most obvious, and that is that the people were leaving in exile. They were under the jurisdiction of the Persian Empire, which had taken over the Babylonian Empire a little bit earlier. they are leaving that land and coming to the land of Israel to rebuild it and rebuild the temple of God, which is very similar, of course, just on the very surface sense of what happened in the Exodus of Egypt. But we'll see a few more things as we go through this chapter, and understanding the differences and understanding the similarities are very important, and that's one of the main lessons we're going to try to learn from this coming chapter. So first, some history. Uvishnas, this is verse 1. Uvishnat achas l'koresh melech paras. In the first year of the reign of King Cyrus, the king of Persia, lichlos devar Adonai mipi Yirmiyahu, to complete, in the fulfillment of the completion of the word of God, mipi Yirmiyah, that had been told to Jeremiah. As we know, Yirmiyahu had prophesied that the people would be in exile after the destruction for 70 years, and then they would return. The people therefore knew and understood that this was going to happen. They were going to go back. Similar to Egypt, where there was a promise. God had made a promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, that people their descendants, were going to go to a land, they were going to be enslaved, and they would eventually be rescued and brought back to the land of Israel. Similar here, Jeremiah received a prophecy from God stating that after 7 years of exile, the people were going to return. We're very familiar, those of us that studied with us, the story told in Daniel, where Daniel had calculated the 70 years, and God then had not yet returned the people to the land. And we're familiar with Daniel's very desperate plea and prayer to God and crying to God as to why he hadn't rescued the people. The answer to Daniel at the time was, to make a long story short, but basically it's that hang in there, it's going to happen. Basically, you calculated wrong, but it will happen. The Heir, so at this point, excuse me, now the time has come. So I'm still in the middle of verse 1. Heir Adonai et ruach koresh melech paras. God aroused the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, who was at this point the most powerful leader in at least the known world, at least in that part of the world. God aroused his spirit. And in response to this spiritual arousal that Cyrus had, he made an announcement of great proclamation in his entire kingdom, and even in writing, Lamar, saying as follows. Now, the extra words "v'gam b'michtav" and even in writing reminds us of the importance of the writing of decrees in the Persian Empire. If you remember, especially most famously in the book of Esther, the idea that which is written, and we've seen this in several other books as well, dealing with this time period, that which is written in the kingdom of Persia cannot be rescinded. This is how the great bureaucracy of the Persian Empire was run. Once the king writes a proclamation, this proclamation can never be taken down, can never be contradicted. So again, here we see a similarity. It's Heir Hashem es ruach Koresh melech paras. God aroused the spirit of Koresh. In the similar way that we find by Paro in Egypt, where God explicitly is controlling Pharaoh's heart. He's the one who is constantly, I'm going to harden his heart, but over here, and so on. But over here, in one way, it's similar. That the pasuk, the Torah, the verse is teaching us clearly that it is God controlling the actions of the king. On the other hand, in Paro's time, after the 10th plague, the slaying of the firstborn, Paro turned around and finally said, "Get out of here and go." Right? At that point, it does not say that God aroused him. It's just Pharaoh finally woke up on his own and said, "Get the people out of here." But over here, it is God telling Koresh, "Allow the people to leave. I want them to go." Ko Amar Koresh Melech Paras. This was the proclamation as was written. So says, this is verse 2, so says Cyrus the king of Persia, Kol mamlechos haaretz nasan li Adonai Elohei hashamayim. All of the kingdoms of the land God has given to me. In other words, I am the most powerful king. I rule over all the nations of the world. And it was who gave me the rulership over these lands? It was God, the Hashemayim, the God of the heavens. Note several very important things here. First of all, he calls God the God of the heavens, which almost gives a little hint that there's the God of the heavens, but there's also God of this, God of that, and the other thing. So he's kind of saying that God is the most powerful one. He's the one who's the God of the heavens, but he's not letting go of his innate, inborn idolatry, which believes in other gods. The other thing is he does not call, that's one side. On the flip side, he calls God the Elokei Hashemayim, the God of the heavens. He does not call God the God of Israel. When the Jewish prophets talk of God, very often we find the term God, the God of Israel, Kadosh Yisrael, the Holy One of Israel. We saw many terms in reference to God's special relationship to the chosen people. And that's all well and good when you're talking to the chosen people, to the Jews. But when you're talking to the world, or if you are the king of the mightiest empire in the world, you are the Melech Paras, the king of Persia, then when you look at God, you see him as the God of the heavens, not just the God of the Jews. So on the one hand, Koresh is being more inclusive. On the other hand, but when it comes to who God is, he's being less monotheistic and more polytheistic. However, he acknowledges, V'hu pakad olai livnos no bayis b'Yerushalayim. He, God, has now pakad. He has appointed me. Now, this language, pakad, is also the language used in the Exodus when to denote remembering. God remembered the Jewish people. It also uses the language of pakad, right? So it's, again, a hint towards that other time, that other redemption, that other Exodus and return. So God appointed me, livnos lo bayis, to build for him a house, b'Yerushalayim asher b'Yehuda, in the city of Jerusalem, which is in the land of Judah. Mi bochem mikol amo. Then he knows that who is the nation that lives there? That's Yehuda. It's the land of Judah, right? He's still calling it the land of Judah, even though there really weren't any Judeans living there, at least for several generations now, for about 70 years. But he knows that the people that are the people of Judah, that are still looking to go back it's their ancestral land. Anyone among you, meaning among the people in my kingdom, who are Mikol Amo, from any of his nation, of this God's nation, this God has a special nation, we're aware of who they are, any of you, Yehi Elohavimo, may his God be with him. So here he is saying that this God, who is the God of the heavens, who has appointed me to do this, has a nation that specially worships him, just like every other God that I have in my kingdom have a nation or a group of people that are associated with that God. So does this one. So any of those people, those Judeans, V'yal Yerushalayim asher b'Yehuda, may he go up to Jerusalem. He now may go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah. V'yiven es beis Adonai Elohei Yisrael, and I want him to then involve himself in building the house of God, the God of Israel. So here, the God who aroused Koresh was Elokei Hashemayim, was the God of the heavens. But that God has, which is the nation that worships him, and where is his temple built? It's in Jerusalem, and his nation is the nation of Israel. I want them to return there and build him his temple, Hu Elohim asher b'Yerushalayim, because he is the God that lives in Jerusalem. So now he is minimizing the God. He was Elokei Hashemayim before, but now he is just the God of the Jewish people and the one that happens to have a house in Jerusalem. So he's got close to monotheism, but he veered away. But he also recognized the special relationship between God and his people. So he acknowledged in verse 3 that we just read that some of the people will have a spirit with him and they will arise and go to Jerusalem, but whoever else who it remains from and from whatever place they have now scattered to within my realm of my kingdom, wherever he lives, Asher Gershom Yinaseu Anshe Mikomo. Let the people of his place, in other words, it's the people of his place here means those that are also members of the that live with him, but are also from his people, right? And over here, it sounds like Anshe Mikomo also might mean the non-Jews that live where the Jews live, the ones who are leaving where they live, right? Let them lift them up. How do they lift them up? By giving them b'chesef u'v'zav, silver and gold, u'v'rechush, and valuable items, u'v'vehema, and animals, im hanidava, together with the donations, leveso alim asher b'Yerushalayim, these donations, together with the donations that the people themselves are bringing to Jerusalem with them for the building, may the people that live near them, who are not traveling to Jerusalem, give them gold and silver and so on. So Koresh here, Cyrus here, is basically explaining how this Beis Hamikdash is going to be funded. The Ibn Ezra points out that B'chol HaNishra means the people that can't afford to do it by themselves, let them at least contribute money. Now this could be viewed as either a command by Cyrus, I'm commanding you to do it, or it's also could be looked upon as permission to do it, that you won't, because it won't be looked upon as some sort of rebellion against the kingdom if you could contribute to this cause, because people may look at it, may be concerned that the king will look at it as some sort of rebellion. They're building a new temple, a new capital, but I'm telling you now not to worry about it. You can donate. So it's either permission or a command, depending on how you look at it. Some look at it as if it's talking to the Jews that don't go up can contribute, that only Jews can contribute. Others understand this to mean those that live with them, not just the Jews that live there, but even the Gentiles that live there. So there's different ways to understand this pasuk. Now, okay, so let's go on to verse 5. Vayakum, and so what happened? So the people heard, that was the decree. So now, what happened? So Vayakumu Rashei Ha'avos, the heads of the families, Yehuda, for the tribe of Yehuda, of Judah, of Binyamin, and Benjamin. And we know that the two tribes, the Judeans, were really two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The other 10 tribes, by this point, for the most part, had assimilated into the lands into which they were exiled by the Assyrian Empire several hundred years prior, and they were not really part of the picture, although that's not 100% true, because there were members of the 10 tribes mixed in later, and we'll come to talk about them a little bit, but for the most part, they were gone. But the families that were intact were the families of Judah and Benjamin, also V'Yakohanim and the priests, V'Alavim and the Levites, L'chol He'ir Ho'Elohim Esrucho, everyone, every family to whom God aroused his spirit. So here's a big difference between Egypt and leaving Persia. When we left Egypt, everyone left Egypt. But when we left Persia and Babylon, only those that were Ha'ir Emlim Esrucho, only those that were inspired by the Spirit of God, La'alot, to go up to the land of Israel, Livnot, to build at Beit Adonai Asher B'Yerushalayim, the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. Note the emphasis here on building God's temple, but not so much an emphasis on building a nation. It's interesting that when Pharaoh envisioned the people leaving Egypt, he envisioned them going out into the desert to worship their God. He was able to grasp that. But the fact that they wanted to also build their own nation and their own country and their own political capital was not on Pharaoh's mind at all, and he was obviously very against that. Here, Koresh too is very keen on having the temple built, and one wonders what his ulterior motives may have been. Maybe he wanted to get some favor in the eyes of this powerful God to help him, but he wasn't really interested, and people understood that in creating a new power which could be a potential source of conflict in the future, a potential source that might threaten his power and his hold on his kingdom. And the people themselves too, it was a spiritual awakening to go build a temple. But the people, as we saw a little bit in Haggai and Zechariah, The people, though, were hoping for a political redemption as well, but this was not something that they could speak about or talk about in the open. V'chol svivoseim, and all of those that were around them, and seems like v'chol svivoseim is referring to not just the Jewish people around them, but even the non-Jews around them. Chizku bideim, strengthened them. B'chlei chesef, with silver, v'azov, and gold. V'rochush, with valuable items. V'abehemo, with animals. V'amigdanos, and with precious things. Levad kol hisnadev, and aside from all that had been donated, that had been, presumably this kol hisnadev had been donated by the people that were going themselves. Again, a similarity with Egypt, where we know the Egyptians gave the Jewish people in Egypt tons of valuable items and so on as they were leaving Egypt. Again, a clear parallel to that time. V'hamelech Koresh, so now the king himself is going to contribute also to the rebuilding of the temple, but interestingly, he doesn't take what's actually his own funds. What he's going to take are actually stolen funds from the original Beis Hamikdash. So the king is not quite so generous. Rather than giving his own money, he's giving back money that really didn't belong to him in the first place. Anyway, but let's see, verse 7. The king Cyrus, Hotzi et Kelei Beit Adonai, he then went and he took out all of the vessels that were vessels that had originally come from the temple in Jerusalem. Asher Hotzi Nebuchadnezzar Yerushalayim, that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, whose descendants were conquered, right, by Persia. So now Persia had the Babylonian archives. So he went to the Babylonian archives and took all of the temple vessels that were there. Vayitneim beveis Elohav. And Nebuchadnezzar had taken these vessels and put them in the house of his god, the god of Babylon. Vayotziim Koresh melech Paras. And Koresh, Cyrus, the king of Persia, took them out. Al yad Misridos hagizbor. He took them out through the hands of Mithridat, who was appointed over these archives. He was the archivist, the one who made sure that everything in the archives were taken care of. So Mithridat went and he said, okay, temple vessels. He said, open up box number 12, room 4, and these are all of the things. He gave them to Koresh, Vayisperem, and he counted them out exactly, because apparently the Jewish people knew what it was that was stolen from the temple and brought to Babylon. And he counted them out and gave them l'sheish batzar hanasi Yehuda, to the prince of Yehuda, the leader of the Judeans, whose name was Sheish Batzar. The identity of Sheish Batzar is one of the favorite discussions people have when they discuss this book. He's someone that doesn't really show up in many places. We know from many places, in Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, we learned it. We'll see here in this book and shortly, that the leader, the Nasi of the Jewish people who led them from a political standpoint, who led them to the return of the land of Israel, was Zerubbabel, who was a direct descendant of the Davidic line from Yoyachin, who was the last king who was exiled to Babylon, who lived in Babylon, had a descendant, Zerubbabel, who led the people. And Zerubbabel was actually a potential Mashiach, a potential Messiah, which we learned about in the last few books we learned together. Sheish Batzar, who is this? Rashi brings a tradition that identifies Sheish Batzar with Daniel. This is what the Gemara identifies him with Daniel, which is a very interesting comparison. Daniel would have been, by this point, extremely old, probably in his 90s or so, because he was a young boy taken in exile years ago, so let's say about 3 generations, 70 plus years ago. So we're looking at a very, very old man, which might make some sense, because Sheish Batzar sort of disappears after this, and we find Zerubbabel leading. It's possible that Daniel was then very elderly and leading the people, but then he would have passed away, maybe even before the people went back to the land. And by that point, after Daniel passed away, or Sheish Batzar by this name, it would have been Zerubbabel. So that's one possible suggestion that Chazal say, that Sheish Batzar was actually Daniel. Another and many of the Mefarshim identify Sheish Batzar as Zerubbabel himself, which is problematic because later we'll find the two mentioned together, Sheish Batzar and Zerubbabel, as if they're different people. So, but many Mefarshim assume that since we know for sure that Zerubbabel was the one that led the people back to Jerusalem, and Sheish Batzar is here being called the Nasi LaYehuda, who's leading the people, who's presumably going to lead the people back, so they must be the same person. A third approach, and this seems to be the approach of Reb Sadia Gaon, but it's not completely clear, but that is that he's just another guy, Sheish Batzar. This was the one who was in charge of the things, and he was a Nasi LaYehuda. Maybe there was, and Zerubbabel had a different title, or he was also a leader. There was just a different person. So what are the things, what's the numbers, the countings of things, items that were originally from the Beit HaMikdash that were given back to Sheish Batzar? Verse 9, Ve'ela misparam, this is the numbers of things, Agar Telei Zahav Shloshim, 30 golden bowls or basins, Agar Telei Chesef Elef, 1,000 silver ones, Machalafim Tisha V'Esrim. A chalaf here is referring to a knife, so 29 knives. Kipore Zahav Shloshim, another type of bowl, 30 gold ones. Kipore Kesef Mishnim, and these double silver bowls, whether there might be two bowls or a double bowl. Arba Meos V'Asora, 410. Kalim Acherim Elef, and 1,000 other various vessels. Kol Kalim La Zahav La Kesef, all the vessels in gold and silver. Chameshes Alafim V'Arba Meos, there were 5,400. Hakol He'elah Sheish Batzar, all of these were brought up by Sheish Batzar. Im He'elos Hagola, together with all of those that were coming up from the exile, Mibavel, from Babylon, to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem. Thank you so much for studying Ezra chapter 1. Looking forward to studying Ezra chapter 2 and the rest of this book of Ezra together.